Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook and I am the solicitor at BJC with day-to-day responsibilities for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And I'm here with my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of the group, having very sadly lost her husband to COVID. And we're here today to discuss week 4 of the COVID inquiry, module 3.
Good morning, Nicola. Just the two of us today, unusually, but I kind of like that because maybe we can discuss some things in more detail. I think the first thing we have to do is address the elephant in the room, which is that the chair, Lady Hallett, was apparently taken ill last week. It started early in the week and she had to close the hearings early. And then the last day was canceled. And at least this morning, I looked at the COVID inquiry website, and the agenda is yet to be, it says, is yet to be decided for next week. So I just wonder if we could talk about the impact on the hearings as because of her illness.
Yeah, so everything was fine until Tuesday afternoon, as far as we were aware. And then, quite unusually, the chair said, I'm afraid we're going to have to rise for a moment. And we weren't sure whether something had been said that wasn't supposed to have been said, because there had been talk about redaction of some of the names of more junior officers. And at one point, somebody said that someone's name had been said and it shouldn't have been. So we weren't sure whether it related to that or something completely different. It then became clear that actually she had been unwell. She came back in. We sat for around about another, I think, hour and a half. And then she said again, we're going to have to rise. And you could see she was rushing out of the room, but made it very clear we'd all be back on Wednesday at 10 a.m, which we were. So we sat on Wednesday as usual. We rose for a slightly earlier lunch, round about 1:45 instead of 1. And around about 1:45, we were getting ready to go back into the hearing room when we were told that actually we wouldn't be sitting that afternoon at all. We weren't told the reason why, but we assumed it was because the chair wasn't feeling any better. And then later that evening, we had an update to say that we wouldn't then be sitting on the Thursday and we would be back in the hearing room on Monday morning at 10:30. What we don't know is whether the hearing for next week will go ahead with the timetable as planned, or whether all the witnesses will be moved back to finish the witnesses that should have finished their evidence on Wednesday, and then also fit in the witnesses who were due to be called on Thursday. As you can imagine, it's quite a logistical issue to have the timetable in place, have all your witnesses arranged and ready for certain days. So to then move everyone around, it's a logistical nightmare, and I don't envy the inquiry that task at all. We have actually been in touch and said, can we be involved in any discussions about any movements, because they've already told us that 2 witnesses are no longer going to be called. One is Dr. Stuart Edwardson, who was due to give evidence last week. We were told that because of the evidence that had been heard already, they didn't feel the need for him to be called to give evidence, and that his statement would be the only evidence from him. We weren't consulted on that decision. Then we've been told that Professor Gale, who is the expert who was going to be called to give evidence on ischemic heart disease, this was one of the non-COVID conditions that was going to be explored. They've said that he's now not going to be called to give evidence. Again, we weren't involved in discussions about that. And what we don't want is for witnesses who we think are of crucial importance to be removed from the timetable. So we asked to be involved in discussions on that. And we've been thanked but told no.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that the core participants in this inquiry aren't included in that. And also, you as our lawyers have to be prepared for whatever's coming up. So I just, I share your frustration. I wonder, just generally, I wonder what the impact on the when a massively expensive inquiry like this grinds to a halt, what the knock-on effect is. And secondly, I'm wondering, there's only one. This must be a problem if you have only one judge. Do inquiries ever have more than one judge? Was that an option for this inquiry?
You would never have more than one chair. What you can have are people who sit alongside the chair, whether they are panel members or sometimes they're referred to as assessors. If they are assessors, they tend to have a particular area of specialism. So I think on the post office inquiry, there are a couple of assessors who sit alongside the chair on that. So they might have particular expertise in IT systems, given the nature of that inquiry. On this inquiry, we don't have panel members or assessors, it's just the chair alone. In other major cases that you might have, such as major inquests like Hillsborough, we had a panel of jurors, and there would be a problem if there was one member of the jury who fell sick. The entire day would have to be stopped, and there were many days that we lost to jury sickness. So I think, given how much technology has moved on, it would be perfectly plausible for the chair to have sat at home and attended remotely. I know the chair in the post office inquiry has done that on many times because I think he has had some health issues. So there are ways around it, and taking more regular breaks and things like that. But whether that would have helped in this instance, I don't know.
And I'm just asking you to speculate now. Obviously, we hope the chair recovers and it's just a little bug that was passing through. But what would happen, generally speaking, in an inquiry if the judge became unwell for a longer period or was unable to continue in the job?
It depends on the nature of the inquiry. So generally, everything would just stop whilst we waited for the chair to recover. I think in this instance, where it's quite a modular format, so if we were looking at months and months and months, it may be that a different chair would be able to hear the likes of module 4 or 5. I think because we are right in the middle of the evidence, we wouldn't then continue this with a different chairperson because she's already heard so much evidence, she will have read so much, and you really want to keep that consistency. So yeah, it really, I think for something short term like this, we just wait for her to recover and send her our best.
Well, thank you for that. I wonder if we could move on to the witnesses now. I was interested to see there were quite a few impact evidence witnesses. We can come to that. As you know, our group is allowed once a year an impact witness. So I was interested to hear we had some from the BMA and from the TUC. But On the first day, we had Sir Frank Atherton, who is the Chief Medical Officer, the CMO for Wales. And I know that he talked a lot about, he seemed to me very disgruntled a lot of the time, and just about how Wales, compared to some other parts of the nation, of the country, were under-resourced. Tell me what you thought about him.
So yeah, Frank Atherton is the last CMO to give evidence in this module. The other three CMOs gave evidence last week. This is the third time he's given evidence. He gave evidence in module 1, then in module 2B, which is the Welsh submodule. And so this is his third. Quite prickly, quite defensive, at times a little rude, particularly to counsel for the Welsh COVID bereaved. And some of his evidence was quite extraordinary. I mean, he started out being asked how he would like to be referred to, because he's a sir. And he said, "Doctor, that's how the people of Wales know me." And I'm reliably informed from some Welsh that there are plenty of other names he's known by too, none that will be repeated here. So he talked, or he was asked about the IPC cell, which we've heard a lot about in this module. And so he said that they never deviated from the guidance of the IPC cell, because partly they were the experts, which is interesting because the chair of the IPC cell, Lisa Ritchie, continually claimed she wasn't an expert, but also because it was important to have consistency across the 4 nations. He also said it wasn't his role to second guess the IPC cell. And to me, it seemed like he contradicted himself a few times, because as we know, there was this massive divergence of opinion about whether CPR was an aerosol generating procedure. So the Resuscitation Council UK, who you would think are the experts on CPR, which is part of resuscitation, in their view, CPR was an aerosol generating procedure. So the Chief Nursing Officer, Jean White, raised with the CMO that perhaps they needed to deviate from what the IPC cell was saying and what Public Health England was saying, and align themselves with what the Resuscitation Council was saying. And Frank Atherton said he agreed with his deputy, Chris Jones, that they shouldn't wade into this, they shouldn't endorse the RC UK statements, and that actually it was for each of the health boards to decide for themselves which PPE should be used. And bearing in mind, he said that they didn't disagree with the IPC cell because they wanted to ensure consistency across the 4 nations. It seems hypocritical to then say, but then each of the health boards can decide what they're going to do, because surely that means that there's no consistency across Wales, let alone across the 4 nations. And then he said that they did bring a consistent voice, and that Jean White and he consistently said they should follow the IPC guidance on PPE. But then he's just disagreed with Jean White by saying not to follow the Resuscitation Council. And so his evidence to me seemed full of contradictions.
I agree with you, and I found it difficult to follow some of what he was saying. One thing that struck me, a couple of things about his testimony struck me. One was when they talked about nosocomial COVID infections, and those are, if I remember correctly, infections that are acquired in hospital. hospital-acquired COVID. And they quoted a figure at him, something like there have been 25,000 nosocomial COVID infections in hospital recorded since March 2020. And I think counsel was suggesting, would that possibly mean something was awry with the IPC advice? And he just denied that absolutely. He said it couldn't be. It didn't necessarily follow. And he said you couldn't totally eradicate it, which I thought, well, we're not talking about totally eradicating it. We're talking about mitigating it. But he simply refused to accept the idea that if things go wrong, it could be because the IPC advice was wrong or inadequate somehow.
This was another piece of really extraordinary evidence from him. And I don't really think counsel to the inquiry managed to pin him down on this. So he referred to the nosocomial transmission group, which they had. And he said that the purpose of this group was to monitor rates of transmission. So he talked about the nosocomial transmission group, the NTG, and he explained that the purpose of this group was to monitor nosocomial transmissions. He said that repeated hospital outbreaks would not mean that IPC measures were not effective or were not being followed. He wouldn't accept that you could link one to the other. And as you say, he said it's impossible to completely eradicate nosocomial transmission, no matter how good your IPC is. And counsel to the inquiry did say, well, we're not talking about eradication, we're talking about reducing transmission. And if there are repeated outbreaks, then surely whatever you're doing isn't working or it's not enough. So surely you have to do something more. You have to look at it, you have to review it. And then they referred to a document which included this line: the NTG routinely monitors rates of transmission, but not with the expectation that there is a direct correlation between the guidance issued and lower infection rates. And this is an extraordinary line. And counsel to the inquiry asked, what's the purpose of issuing guidance if there's no expectation that it will make any difference to transmission? And the answer that Frank Atherton gave was very difficult to follow. He basically explained that, again, that just underlines that hospital transmission can't be eradicated. And counsel to the inquiry did try to pin him down on this, and again said, we're not talking about eradication, we're talking about mitigation. And he then said, well, I don't know what they had in their mind when they wrote that line. I don't agree with it. And the way we talked about it was, it's like the fire service saying, our job is to monitor where there are fires, but we don't go and put them out. And we don't try and figure out what the cause of the fire was, we just monitor it. And at one point, counsel to the inquiry, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, but it basically said, would anyone have noticed if the nosocomial transmission group hadn't existed? Because what were they doing? Just monitoring outbreaks, not trying to resolve them, not saying, well, we need to do more, not being able to disentangle what the cause of the outbreak was. What was the point? And I don't think we got a satisfactory answer from him about that.
No, I did find that amazing too, because this nosocomial transmission group, which ran apparently from May 2020 to March 2022, I mean, I'm like, if at the very least, did they find anything out? And I believe counsel asked him, was there a final report once they were disbanded, a final report? And he's like, oh, I can't recall one. I found that extraordinary. It's like, what was the point about that then? So that alone, even information that could have been useful, we didn't have.
Overall, he was a deeply unimpressive witness. And I'm afraid to say, for the people of Wales, he comes across as a deeply unimpressive chief medical officer. let's not forget, at the very start, he said that he didn't read the full papers that came from Sage or Nerve Tag because they were so long, and so he would read the executive summary. And he was at pains to point out, but some of those summaries were very long. You know, they were 30 pages or so. I'm sorry, this is the guy who's giving the country of Wales their advice, and he's not reading all the detail. Not good enough.
I found that extraordinary too, and he seemed tetchy to even be being asked about it. There were two more things in his testimony that I was kind of shocked at. Not, we don't have to discuss it in great detail, but one, I was shocked to see that in Wales, carers who were visiting extremely vulnerable people, they were only asked to wash their hands for 20 seconds. That was the advice given to. There was nothing in there, I don't know if you call it instructions or advice or guidance, I think is the word, about PPE or anything like that. I found that surprising and horrifying.
I recall the evidence of Frank Atherton from Module 2B, where he was questioned at length about his advice to the country as a whole about face masks. And he was very much against recommending face masks or mandating face masks. And Wales only recommended face masks weeks after everyone else had. And they only did it because he became concerned about the mixed messaging and people who live close to borders who were potentially living in Wales or working in England and vice versa. So I think his entire approach to PPE was at odds with the other four nations and what most people believe to be an airborne disease. And he seems to have stuck to this idea of washing your hands, which is, you know, just general good hygiene anyway, but it's not going to stop COVID by itself.
No, well, there was something that happened. The broadcast, and maybe you can enlighten me a little bit. The broadcast was temporarily suspended as I don't know if there was something, if something was put up wrongly. And this was about an email that I believe Atherton received or was quoted in, where he said they didn't want high levels of PPE being used in order that the supply chain should be risked later on. And on the live stream, I saw Lady Helda seemed to be quite touchy at this point. She didn't want to stop. I wasn't sure what happened there. Can you enlighten me?
So this is something that I referred to earlier on, and this was about junior members being named who their names were supposed to be redacted, and I think they had been redacted in the email, but I think one of the council named them, and I think counsel to the inquiry said we may need to rise whilst this is sorted, and the chair just said, oh, don't worry about it, let's carry on. So it wasn't anything major. I think it was just trying to protect more junior members of staff who potentially don't want to, you know, shouldn't really have their name out there because they weren't decision makers or anything like that.
And the other thing that struck me that in his testimony was he made what I consider to be a kind of inappropriate allegory with fracking when he was trying to explain, when he was talking about his views about the precautionary principle, I think it was, because Lady Hallett had asked him about that. I just thought it was inappropriate. You're talking about human beings, not oil.
Yes. He was asked about the precautionary principle, and what he tends to do in his evidence is to take a suggestion and run it to the absolute extreme. So he was asked about the precautionary principle in terms of what face masks should be recommended, and wouldn't it be following the precautionary principle to recommend FFP3s? And so his response was, but if we follow that to its logical conclusion, then we'd be saying everyone should wear the powered respirator hoods, which, well, that's taking the absolute maximum, the most expensive and the best. That's not what the precautionary principle says. The precautionary principle says, in this specific instance, we think it's airborne in the very early stages. We don't know for certain. So until we can rule it out, let's use the FFP3, which can protect against airborne, as opposed to the FRSM, which can't. That's the precautionary principle, not use the best possible method of protecting you from absolutely anything and everything. And then he said that you have to be careful when applying it, because it could stop staff from delivering CPR. So if you recommend an FFP3 for performing CPR and you don't have an FFP3, then the staff won't be able to deliver that CPR. And so you end up risking the patient's lives. But that only works if you have a supply issue. And what we've been told time and time again was that they never ran out of PPE. So why would that be a problem? And then he took it to a really silly extreme of, if someone collapsed on the street and members of the public were there and they wouldn't have access to masks, and what would they do? Well, this was guidance for healthcare workers, and it was about keeping healthcare workers safe whilst delivering care. We're not talking about bystanders on the street. And this is just another time where he's gone to kind of silly extremes to make a point, but it really doesn't work.
No, and as one of the bereaved and as not being an expert, my overall impression of him was that his responses were much more like what we heard from politicians rather than what we've heard from medical people. So like you, I wasn't wildly impressed. All right, next up, if we can move on now we had Dr. Catherine McDonald. She was attending remotely from Northern Ireland. She's the former medical director of Western Health and Social Care Trust, including Magellan Hospital, which is in Northern Ireland on the border with the Republic. Now, this is a spotlight hospital, and we've heard a little bit about these spotlight hospitals. I just wonder, Nicola, if you could tell us a little bit about what those are.
So at some point we were informed by the inquiry that they had selected 22 spotlight hospitals across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. That we never really got to grips with what the criteria was for selecting them. I think we understood that they wanted a broad range of different types of hospitals in different types of geographic areas. So some were urban, some were more remote, some were large, some were small, some had performed well, some not so well. And so they had what we hoped was a broad spectrum. What we had hoped that this term spotlight meant would be a deep dive into those hospitals to look at the issues, because otherwise you're not really shining a spotlight on it. So we had hoped that there would be evidence from not just the head of the hospital, the clinical directors, but the doctors, the nurses, the porters, the cleaners, a full, and patients and bereaved, and so that you had the full range of experience from that hospital, so that you didn't get a corporate witness coming in telling us everything was fine, or, well, no one raised concerns to me. And unfortunately, we haven't got that. So we've had the evidence from Dr. McDonald, as you say, but it's in a vacuum. she's the only person we're hearing from about that hospital. And so there's nothing to contrast her evidence with. There's no one saying, she may be saying that, but my experience was completely different. Or whatever she said, that's exactly how it was. That's how it's just in a vacuum. And so there's nothing really to weigh it up and to say the value of it, unfortunately.
I agree with you. The way you describe what could have been, it kind of makes me sad, because that would have been amazing to have a deep dive like that, where you talk to porters and cleaners, because I don't know if any of them are being called as witnesses. They would be amazing witnesses. I mean, I liked her. She said, again, she felt more like an impact witness, just one of those ones, because again, we just heard about the impact of working in these terrible and unknown conditions. And she did make one interesting point about how they were in the COVID world at the hospital when restrictions outside were lifted, and how strange it was to move between these two universes, the non-COVID world outside and the COVID world inside. Of course, you bring the non, in quotes, COVID world back into your COVID world, I'm sure. And again, we heard, she just said about how, as other witnesses have said, what's of primary importance is the workforce and preparedness and PPE again and again. This is the theme that we keep coming back to.
Yeah, she said that one of the biggest challenges in implementing the IPC guidance was concern amongst the staff that the guidance was based on what equipment they could get hold of rather than what would keep staff safe. And if you are being asked to go into work and you don't agree with the health and safety practices, you don't have confidence that that's going to keep you safe, that must be terribly challenging to go into work and to still trust your bosses and that they have your best interests at heart. That must be extraordinarily damaging, and almost feeling like you're being gaslit by your bosses.
I mean, I feel like we're being gaslit in a way, because again and again, and I'm sorry, I just do not believe it when a lot of the witnesses say, no, none of these decisions were made because there wasn't adequate PPE. I do not believe that. And it's very frustrating to hear some witnesses continue to claim that. On day 2, we had Mark Tilley, who was an ambulance technician. He's represent the TUC, and this was impact evidence. And as I find with a lot of these health worker impact evidence witnesses, it's just incredibly powerful testimony.
Yeah, you could see he was struggling at various points to share his story. Clearly very distressed by some of his experiences. And interesting that because of his role within as a kind of representative, he was able to take more of a back seat so that he could perform those union parts of his role. But he was adamant that he actually wanted to be on the front line to help out his colleagues. So obviously fair play to him for doing that.
Yeah, the one thing he said before we move on that really made an impact on me as well, because it's something I'm thinking about a lot these days. He said we still haven't learned. We should be wearing face masks today. I think for me and a lot of the bereaved that I heard talking about this is one of the most frustrating things. The recommendations on Module 1 have been published. It's clear from anyone following the inquiry, even a little bit, what things that could be done now should be done now. And it kind of broke my heart hearing him say that. After him, we had Anthony Marsh, who is the National Ambulance Advisor to NHS England and was a former chair of the Association of Ambulance Chief Executive. He came in his uniform. He looked very, very impressive. What did you make of his testimony?
So he is a witness who we had made an application to put a large number of questions to, and our application was refused in its entirety. Some of the questions we were told it's not appropriate. Some of the questions we were told that counsel to the inquiry were going to ask. And I think his evidence is just, it's a very, very frustrating example of how things unfold, particularly when we're not allowed to be involved. So he was asked whether he agreed if there were times during the pandemic that demand outstripped capacity in the 999 call handling centres, and he did. And he was then asked, was enough done to prevent this happening early in the pandemic? And his answer was, I don't believe it was. And then there was no follow-up. It was just nothing. It was just that answer was banked and they moved on to the next point rather than exploring that issue any further. So that was frustrating. And then another topic that we had wanted to ask a lot of questions about was Protocol 36. We had included this in our opening statement because it's so important. So usually, if you ring 999 and say you have breathing difficulties, an ambulance is dispatched to you as category 1, which means it's supposed to get to you within 7 minutes. What happened during the pandemic was they realized that they were going to be inundated with people ringing up with breathing difficulties. So they changed the categorization so that if you rang up and said you had breathing difficulties, but also had symptoms of COVID, you would then categorize as category 2, which means the ambulance is targeted to get to you within 18 minutes, not 7. If you are struggling to breathe, regardless of the cause, if 7 minutes is considered enough, that's really how long it should take to get an ambulance to you. How is it considered safe to extend that 7 minutes to 18 minutes? If you're struggling to breathe, you potentially don't have those 11 extra minutes. And we had a whole series of questions that we wanted to ask about this. And anyone watching his evidence would not have the understanding of Protocol 36 that I've just shared with you now, because it just didn't come out that way. And there was just no clarity at all. He used phrases like, oh, the patient pathway, the breathing algorithm, and his answer was all about how we can safely deal with the patient, whereas really it's about how we can ensure that people with breathing difficulties that aren't COVID related still get the 7-minute response, whereas if you are COVID related, then we'll get to you within 18 minutes if we can. That just seems totally extraordinary. And I'm afraid this part of the inquiry, the questioning wasn't clear enough, and his answers weren't tidied up and picked up in the way they should have been.
And I think for people listening, the bereaved listening, that's going to be hard to hear because, again, it seems like if you had COVID or were suspected of COVID, you were kind of thrown under the bus. To me, that's what that sounds like. They're willing to let you die. They're willing to take those extra 11 minutes. Yeah, that's horrifying. He said one thing that struck me, when the PPE was downgraded by the IPC cell, coming back to them, he did say that it was done without consulting them, the air ambulance people, and he raised concerns, he said, and the advice he was given was to follow the guidance of the IPC cell. We keep coming back to that again and again.
And this is where the evidence from Mark Tilley, the witness before him, and also the evidence of Tracy Nichols from a previous week from the College of Paramedics comes in, because they talk about the reality of working in an ambulance. it's so different to the way you work in a hospital where there is space. In the back of an ambulance, you have no ventilation, there's no windows. You have to hang up your coat next to where the patient is. That's the coat that you then wear home around your family. It's not like you have a locker. When you go out to work at the start of a shift, you've got no idea whether you're going to be able to get back to restock with extra levels of PPE. They couldn't get the full coveralls. They were having to make do with aprons that don't cover your arms. In warmer weather, where your arms are bare, that's fine because you can get a shower, and Mark Tilley explained, but in colder weather where you've got your jacket on, those the arms of your jacket are exposed, but you can't then wash that to, in the way that you'd be able to wash your own body. And it really is just a lack of appreciation of what it's like to work in an ambulance. And just follow the IPC guidance. That's not good enough when it hasn't properly taken into account the working environs of being in an ambulance.
And being in an air ambulance as well, because he said they can't decontaminate an aircraft sufficiently. And he said they use the hoods. We talk about hoods a lot. And he said they used hoods. And at one point, the chair asked question, I think it was on behalf of Kata, we had Dr. Jones on the other week, why would you use hoods if you accept the IPC recommendations? And he said, oh, we only used hoods in AGPs, aerosol generating procedures. And he said they never would have been wearing a type 2 mask if they would have been wearing FFP3s, but if they didn't have a hood. He said in the West Midlands, we didn't have FFP3s. They had been withdrawn. I was confused by that.
I share that confusion. So the Canter question was, why weren't you recommending this specific type of PPE for the country, but at the same time you were making sure that your local service got it? That seemed to be almost like, well, I'll look after my own workforce, but for the rest of you, you're not going to get it. Certainly that's what the question was aimed at. And I'm not sure I understood his answer to that at all, I'm afraid.
So we don't have to stay long with the next witness, but I did want to just touch on her, was Dr. Tilna Tilakumar. I hope I've said that right. It was impact evidence. She was representing the BMA, the British Medical Association. She's a GP. She's another one who broke my heart. She worked in mental health and was redeployed to a hospital with people who had complex mental health needs and needed inpatient care for life. And she just talked about, at one point, she was the only doctor because they were all falling ill. And she talked about trying to organize chaos. And this enraged me. She said they had to buy and source their own PPE. They were going on Amazon and buying whatever. And counsel said, were you reimbursed? And she said, no, we were never reimbursed. And it was a small moment in the inquiry, but it made me blazing with rage when you think of the VIP lane and people who made fortunes from this, whereas the frontline staff were having to protect themselves as best they could. This doctor is another one who is utterly broken. She talked about suffering from depression, and it's heartbreaking to hear this kind of testimony.
Yeah, some of the particular incidents that she mentioned, they were horrifying. And she delivered it in such a almost cold and clinical matter-of-fact way, quite emotionless. And I think towards the end of her evidence, you could see why. She was just barely keeping it together. Her experiences on that particular ward were horrifying. And I think one of the worst instances she talked about was when she said a visiting manager came to the ward and a healthcare assistant was wearing a plastic apron. and the manager pulled it off her, basically saying it wasn't needed. And then just very, very quietly, she said the worker was black and the manager was white. So that worker would have already had a greater risk if exposed. And that was just an appalling incident to have happened regardless of the ethnicity. But when you do know the ethnicity and you know the risk levels, it becomes much, much worse. Just appalling.
That was appalling. It was an awful moment. And just, I don't know, just these impact witnesses who are healthcare workers, just to see how we burned up those resources. Many of them have left the profession. There was just no care given. There's still, it seems there's no care given. She said herself she was burnt out. It just breaks my heart.
When she did try to get mental health support, she was advised that she was probably suffering from PTSD. And so when she did actually speak to someone about it, they told her, no, you don't have PTSD, you're fine. Just being told that you aren't suffering to that degree, it's, again, quite extraordinary because she clearly has suffered.
We also had some experts in intensive care, Professor Charlotte Summers and Dr. Ganesh Sundaralingam. I hope I've said that correctly. They testified together. And I wonder what you thought of them.
Very interesting. Professor Summers, I found her evidence understandable, easy to follow. Dr. Sundaralingam, I wouldn't say the same of. Some of the evidence was extraordinary. So the first thing to say is the way we count intensive care beds. So in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, we count the number of beds that can be staffed. So that's how many intensive care beds they have. Makes sense, right? In England, we don't count them that way. We count the theoretical number of intensive care beds. So the absolute maximum number of beds we could possibly surge up to. Now, to me, that sounds like you're cooking the books, because if you've got more beds, then you're not going to fill them all. But the experts said that this wasn't meant with any ill intentions, that it was logical, because then you know when you're nearing capacity. I mean, I think the way Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland does that just as well. And I think their numbers were probably truer, because if you have the actual number of beds as opposed to theoretical number of beds, then clearly you're going to know when you're running out. So that was extraordinary.
Did she say it was because, depending on how you read it, it looks like you can mistaken. It may look like there's spare capacity when there isn't. Was that one of her criticisms of that system, or observations about that system?
Yeah, it just, obviously, if it's a theoretical bed, then it's going to take more to turn it into an actual bed. I'm still not entirely sure how that works. So yeah, I think, bearing in mind all the evidence we've heard was about it's better to have consistency across the 4 nations. So why England opted to count beds in a different way? Well, what about border towns where, Wales says, well, you've got all these spare theoretical beds in Chester, can you take some of ours? Would we be able to take them? I have no idea. It seems bonkers to me. I think we should either all count them in the same way, or it's just bound to lead to confusion and potential disaster. But I'm a simple person.
one thing I noticed about Dr. Ganesh Lingam was, oh my gosh, the speed at which that man spoke was extraordinary. And I found him really hard to follow because of that.
He spoke incredibly quickly. He also had a habit of clipping the end of each word, so he wouldn't quite complete the word, which again made it difficult to follow. And if someone speaks very quickly or not clearly, I revert to looking at the transcript. And so you could see that the stenographer was struggling to keep up as well. And that's really where you need counsel to step in and slow down. And they need to be keeping an eye on the transcript to see when the stenographer is struggling. Because a lot of us were. I think at one point, if I'd been making notes by hand and had a pen in my hand rather than typing, I did the typing equivalent of throwing my pen on the table because I just kind of gave up at one point. It was too difficult. But the other piece of extraordinary evidence he gave that I was able to follow was about this CritCon levels. So CritCon is the critical condition. So CritCon 0 is normal. CritCon 1 is a bad winter. CritCon 2 is when you have a medium-sized surge and it's unprecedented. CritCon 3 means you're operating at or near capacity and you're at risk of overwhelm. And CritCon 4 is an emergency. You're there, you're overwhelmed. And so he was asked about the number of hospitals that had declared CritCon 4. And I'm afraid this is where he lost me a bit because I didn't really understand this. But what he said was that where CritCon 4 was declared, it probably didn't actually mean CritCon 4, that it was potentially a typo, or it was really just a CritCon 3 in extreme, essentially a cry for help. And then he used this bizarre analogy of if it was a typo and it wasn't supposed to be a CritCon 4, that it meant the system was working, because occasionally you want your fire alarms to go off so that you can tell they're working. I mean, yes, but I still don't follow why that means that a CritCon 4 wasn't a genuine CritCon 4. I mean, surely no one was pressing the button just to check that the people were listening. They were pressing the bell because they needed help. So I hope when they do come back to give evidence that this point is cleared up. Because the chair fell ill during their evidence, they didn't get to complete their evidence, so they will be recalled at some point. We don't know whether that will be first thing on Monday. They might already have other arrangements. They might be recalled at a far later date. We simply don't know. But I really do hope that this is an issue that's cleared up, because it seems quite an important area that we need to have some clarity on.
Yes, I'll be interested to see what their testimony is next week, if they're back, if we're back. I have to say, Nicola, over this module, is this week 4? Wow, it kind of goes fast. But I continue to be impressed by the resourcefulness and the resilience of so many of the frontline staff. And I continue to be disgusted at how they were let down as regards to preparation, as regards to communication, as regards to being given resources and consistent and good guidance.
And if we follow the timetable as it's supposed to be for next week, I'm afraid that pattern will continue. The good news is we are due to hear from more impact witnesses, which is where the real evidence is of, what was actually happening. But as I say, whether there's a change to the timetable for next week, I just don't know at the moment. But totally agree with you. And I just wish that there were more people giving evidence about what it was like on the front line from their perspectives. Because every time we hear someone say, we never ran out of PPE, everyone who needed a ventilator got one, NHS was not overwhelmed, it's maddening. And we need to hear from the people who can say that wasn't true.
I agree 100%. And the bereaved, many of whom have firsthand lived experience that those things are not true. I can't imagine what it's like for them to hear that. It's been kind of fun, just the two of us today, Nicola. I think by the time this airs, we might know what's happening next week. At the moment, as I said, there's
Hopefully.
nothing on the website. Yeah. But as always, thank you for your input and for explaining things so well to us. And I look forward to next week.
All right. Thanks very much for your time, Lorelei.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.